Hello and welcome to the evolution of Harlem from the 19th century to 1930. First, let's look at sources. When looking at sources for my paper, the difficult part of my research was not finding relevant material, but choosing which to pursue. Harlem and its evolution have attracted a multitude of historians to its history. For my primary sources, I relied on newspapers, pictures, and historical maps, which helped me understand the historical context of the happenings of the city and allowed me to have a window into the events that shaped the city. The secondary sources I have chosen were 5 monographs and an article, each looking at a different aspect of the whole. I utilized our textbook, The City, A Global History. One of the monographs I want to bring extra attention to, however, is Jacob A. Riis's 1901, How the Other Half Lives, as it shaped my understanding of life in the tenements of Harlem. By focusing on his book on life in the tenements, its neighborhoods, its people, first-hand accounts, and introspections, Riis helped bring their needs to the minds and hearts of those responsible for the development of Harlem during its transformation. History of Harlem, from Dutch village to America's largest city. Harlem, originally established in 1609 by Dutch settlers, had remained a small village nestled within the bosom of Greater New York until the mid-1800s. Aided by mass European migration and international American migration, New York became the largest city in America by 1900, more than twice the population of its nearest rival, Chicago. New York was also a city of big business by 1900, with 60% of all bank transactions going through New York banks and 40% of all international American trade going through New York's ports. In this bustling metropolis, Harlem is one of the most dynamic neighborhoods, a neighborhood that would help to shape the very idea of what it meant to be an American. Diaspora of Harlem. The diaspora of Harlem is continually in flux. Over the century between 1812 and 1914, more than 6 million Germans immigrated to New York, many of them settled in Harlem. However, after the Irish potato famine of 1845, the demographic began to shift as more Irish laborers moved into the shanty towns of Harlem's less developed areas while working to build the homes of some of the city's wealthiest and most influential people. Most Irish were unskilled laborers, and by 1855 as much as 74% of domestic service and 86% of New York's labor force were Irish. In the 1840s, almost 90% of Irish Catholics were voting Democrat. The next diaspora immigrating to Harlem in great number were Sicilian and Neapolitan Italians and Eastern European Jews, beginning in the 1870s. These new arrivals were mostly uneducated, unskilled, and poor, making them a very welcome addition to the labor force and the booming economy of post-war Harlem. From 1900 to 1920, over 300,000 mostly Southern black Americans immigrated to Harlem. The population in central Harlem shifted from about 10% black in 1910 to over 32% black by 1920 and continued to grow, reaching over 70% by the 1930s. By the mid-1920s, as many as 40,000 Spanish speakers, about 90% of them from Puerto Rico, had arrived in East Harlem, spreading from the northeast corner of Central Park to Madison Park and then Lexington Avenues. They were increasingly joined by arrivals from the Dominican Republic, whose journey to the United States was expedited by the U.S. occupation of the island from 1916 to 1924. By the end of the decade, following the 1928 hurricane that devastated the islands, New York City's Puerto Rican population was 45,000 strong and centered in East Harlem. How the liminal spaces occurred and transformed Harlem. There was an abundance of liminal spaces within Harlem. Churches created spaces around themselves, imbuing neighborhoods with the distinction of being good or bad. As churches changed hands between diaspora and religions, by proxy, the neighborhoods lost the previous church's influence. This was often seen in Harlem when a non-black church was bought by a black community. The surrounding neighborhood and shops had become less desirable to white investors and patrons. Other examples of liminal space include the territories that would shift between the diaspora of organized crime and religious factions. For example, a Jewish family would not go through a Catholic neighborhood without being in danger. It could also be said that the gang members caught in another syndicate's territory would also be in danger. With the shift to railway and subway, these zones could safely be traversed, allowing for greater freedom of movement for work and pleasure. Graft and government. Harlem City Councilman William Boss Tweed was one of the most notorious swindlers of the day and used his position of absolute power to engage in all sorts of fraud and embezzlement. One resident even calculated that Tweed made 21 cents off of every cobble laid in Harlem's newly paved streets. However, the greatest memorial to what was his most outrageous graft is still known today as the Tweed Courthouse. The construction of the courthouse dragged out over 11 years between 1861 and 1872, with an actual cost of $250,000. However, Tweed charged the city more than $13 million, or just a little less than twice the cost of the Alaska Purchase. After fleeing to Spain in 1875 to avoid a civil suit, one of the cartoons from the famous Thomas Nast followed and helped identify the fugitive Tweed. Tweed was extradited to the United States and died in prison in 1878. Building Harlem. The Central Park project was one of New York City's most ambitious ventures, beginning in 1857 and finally finishing in 1876. Central Park was America's first urban park, separating downtown from uptown. Before Central Park was built, Harlem was a small community of farms and petite estates. As downtown grew, the edges of the urban center expanded, pushing northward. At the far end of Central Park sat the still quaint village of Harlem. The 1904 opening of the subway line in New York marked a massive change in the flow of life in and out of Harlem. The new high-speed transportation buzz inspired the Harlem local reporter's 15 Minutes to Harlem campaign, as people could now live where they could afford and still work where they needed to. Another one of the major challenges facing New York City development was water supply. In the 1830s, pollution levels became so bad that the city's wells were no longer safe for cooking and drinking. Yellow fever and cholera was so common, the death rate was 1 in every 39 citizens. Municipal authorities proposed the Croton Water Project that would include a dam built on the Croton River, aqueducts, and piping that would provide all Manhattan with clean, safe drinking water. The water project took decades to complete, with 340 miles of pipe finally being laid by 1871. As a consequence of fewer people using the city's wells, the groundwater level rose, causing massive flooding and inspiring the next major civic building project, sewers. By 1852, more than 148 miles of sewer had been laid in New York, and by 1869, Harlem was making plans for laying sewers from 110th Street to the Harlem River. Boom and decline. In 1868, the Harlem property market was so vigorous that housing prices could double or even triple overnight. In 1887, Harlem installed the first electric lights, and the first phone lines were laid the following year. However, by 1893, the housing market in Harlem was experiencing a dramatic decline that left property owners with only 9 of 149 units filled, forcing developers to sell at greatly reduced prices. By the turn of the century, the steady flow of black migration from the American South was becoming a significant population in Harlem. Early 1900 also marked the collapse of the real estate market. Extreme speculation had driven Harlem's property prices out of most people's budgets, and the collapse that followed led to an entirely different group of real estate speculators that would soon reshape Harlem's ethnic makeup. City of Arts and Culture. When people think of what Harlem was, the images conjured will be defined by their connection to it. For some, the conjured images will be from the first New York Opera House, built by Hammerstein, the theaters filled with blackface vaudeville performances and the blending of cultures that produced some of the most famous music that spread around the world, jazz. Others will picture the origins of some of the most influential actors of the era, such as the Marx Brothers, Milton Berle, or Burt Lancaster, just to name a few. Some will think of the tenement slums that had almost 3 times the death rate from disease as other developed cities within the United States. Some of these tenements still stand today. Others will think of Harlem and its proximity to Ellis Island, which for the immigrants of the world was the gateway to the United States. Regardless of whom conjures the imagery of Harlem, this city elicits strong emotion and stands for all the hope and despair that America has to offer.